Chapter 7. She was back on her feet and unable to sit still a few days later, her few plus some. Idly strolling through the pecan grove beneath the expansive canopy of organic arches, she pondered how it was possible to feel such intense longing for a man. She'd spent the better part of her life apart from Clint, but it had never hurt like this. Maybe, she muttered to herself, because there had only ever been infatuation before. A need that sprang from her innocent fantasies about him and had nothing to do with reality. Daydreams that vanished as soon as his lips touched them. It was no longer infatuation. She was afraid of how much she wanted him. Not just to sit and worship a hero, but to spend the rest of her life fighting, working, and falling in love with. Her light green eyes searched for the distant horizon. Now, where was he? With whom was he with? Was there a woman out there who has the ability to melt the hard, haughty heart of his and make it pulsate with desire? She let out a sigh, recalling the seductive expression in his eyes when she had given in to him. That expression, which was new to her, was one of dark, manly triumph mixed with a hunger that seemed as thrilling in memory as it did in reality. It was Clint who had desired her. However, desire was not love, and she sadly wondered if Clint even understood what love was. She would eventually find herself near the small stream, which has a curtain of long, curling gray Spanish moss hanging languidly from the tall oak trees along the edge of the bank. She sighed and looked at the twig and leaf litter beneath the enormous oak where Clint had. She closed her eyes on the memory, hearing the deep, soothing voice in her ear once more, experiencing the slow, confident kiss that had taught her the meaning of a good kiss, and feeling the delicious crush of his arms. If only. She let out another sigh and raised her hand to brush against the moss while tracing the path of the bubbling stream, which snaked like a silver ribbon between the leafy trees. Ah, how I wish. She needed to get out. All of a sudden, she was certain of it. She wouldn't have any protection at all against him if he touched her again, if she stayed here right now, knowing how she felt. She'd have to go, even though she'd promised to stay until Jana arrived. She had never felt more exposed than she did now. She told herself that Clint would not think twice about testing that weakness. It had always been clear to him, or so he thought, how she felt about him. It appeared that he relished his dominance over her. And now, she turned to face the house again. There was nothing left for her to choose. She called that night after dinner, and Jana surprised her by almost seeming to read her mind. "How's it going?" Maggie could almost see her friend smile when Jana asked. She inquired, "How do you think it's going?" "Jana, I love you like a sister, but I'm going to poison you when I get back." "Oh," she sighed. "I'd hoped from what Brent said." "You talked to Brent?" Maggie lost her temper. "However, he's in Hong Kong, right?" Kong. Brent?" Pieces of the puzzle whirled in her brain. "But Clint said, 'My sweet brother threatened to break his arms if he came back down there while you were in residence,'" Jana exclaimed with pride. Maggie struggled to put the puzzle pieces together in a way that made sense during the protracted, static silence. "I don't understand," she muttered absently. "I do. Brent and you were close all along, didn't you?" "Don't you know that my brother doesn't tolerate competition from anybody, Maggie, my dear?" Jana said softly. "He will employ some of the most brutal strategies in the book to obtain what he truly wants. And apparently," she continued with a smug sense of satisfaction, "you're what he wants right now." "If only you knew," Maggie thought to herself. She asked sweetly, "Been eating green toadstools again, huh, Jana? Clint and I are at odds all the time, and we've almost gotten into physical altercations this time. I just want to get home. What time will you be arriving here?" From the other end of the line, there was a wistful sigh. "Saturday," was the response. "Or I'm not sure. Friday night. My vacation was rescheduled. Next week. If you're still committed, we can return to Columbus." The word isn't determined. "Oh, Jana, please come guard me," she groaned. "I'm so tired of fighting." Her friend inquired, "Are you well, Maggie? You, fed up with battling Clint? That must be the first." "I really am, but it'll make all the record books. Will you hurry up?" "All right, since you asked, no problem." "Maggie, why did Clint threaten to break Brent's 2 arms, though?" "Because we stole his rotor, tied bows on his cows' tails, and I filled the swimming pool with a box of bubble bath or 2. Never mind. I assumed it was a romantic gesture." "Maggie, will you please keep out of trouble until I arrive?" "Nothing is easier," she chuckled. "Clint's still gone, and all I have to do is keep out of his way until you get here." When Maggie took Emma's grocery list to Shorty in the late afternoon, she stopped on the front porch to take in the fiery sunset with its blazing fingers of color before heading inside. She believed that nothing in the city could match this. The vastness of the landscape, the aroma of the countryside mixed with flowers, the sound of distant dogs barking, and the quietness of natural sounds. Clint also referred to her as a city girl. Entering the house, she shook her head. He had no acquaintance with her. Unexpectedly, he was in the study when she entered. It felt like a baseball bat being swung in the stomach. The mere sight of him made her heart stop. Wearing a dark brown suit and a cream silk shirt, he appeared to have just returned home. When he saw her standing there in the little yellow sundress with polka dots that she had thrown on a whim, he turned to face her and looked at her with something dark, strange, and violent flashing in his eyes. With deliberate and quiet brushstrokes, he drew her, stopping at the low bodice and the thin straps that bared her smooth, round shoulders, her hair falling elegantly around them. She stammered, hello," as his narrow eyes caught hers. "Hello," he answered back. "Going somewhere?" "Oh, the dress, you mean?" She gave a headshake. It got hot," he thought to himself. It's getting hotter by the minute, as his gaze shifted from her dark, curly hair to her sandals. His eyes expressed a sensual, masculine appreciation that made her swallow nervously. How was your trip?" The question seemed to tighten his face. He turned away, taking a long drag on his cigarette before answering, "Not very pleasant, little girl. To see Johnson, I stopped by Austin." "Duke?" Something sinister stirred within her, something icy and menacing. "How was he?" He muttered, "I made it in time for the funeral." Tears welled up in her eyes at the unexpected blow, recalling in a blur of thoughts the big, dark man, the old tombs, and the allure of the past. "Oh," she said in a broken whisper. With a heavy sigh, he turned. He told her. His plane crashed on the way back home. It was a blessing in a way. He was excruciatingly painful. Additionally, having to wait for it. Though she felt as though something had been ripped out of her, she nodded silently, acknowledging that it was the best. Her face was filled with shameless tears. His gaze grew gloomy. He snarled, "For God's sake, stop it!" Johnson would not approve of that. He wouldn't want you to be upset over his loss. She bit her lip, angry at him for being so cold and callous. "Pardon me," she mumbled. "Caring is the #1 sin in your book of rules, isn't it?" With a turn, she headed for the door. Before she could take 2 steps, he grabbed hold of her and threw her into his firm arms, holding her shaky and trembling body against his warm strength. "It's unbearable to witness you weep," he firmly whispered against her temple. Grasping her hair at the nape, his fingers tensed. She was shocked by the admission until she understood that, similar to most men, he was allergic to tears of any kind. She struggled to gather herself and control the hot tears that were streaming down her cheeks and into her mouth's corners. With unsteadiness, she said, "I liked him. It was as if I'd known him all my life. It happens that way sometimes." His arms tensed, and she felt one slim, warm hand lightly brushed the smooth skin just above the line of her bare back. As his lips touched her forehead, she felt a sudden, heavy sigh beneath her ear, causing her to involuntarily stiffen. With a sudden backward motion, he reached for his jacket's inside pocket. He said, passing her an open envelope. This was in Johnson's pocket. You were the recipient of it. I was asked to deliver it by his nephew. With trepidation, she swallowed and fixed her gaze on the tiny white envelope she was holding, highlighting her name in a bold black pen along with the ranch's address. For myself? What is it exactly? He moved away from her to get his cigarette out of the ashtray on his desk, saying, I don't know. We didn't think we should have the right to read it. She sighed and fingered it. With Clint just a few feet away, she couldn't bring herself to open it. Later, I'll read it. Jana called Clint. She will arrive on Saturday. With a harsh face and narrowed eyes, he spun around on his heels. He demanded angrily, Did you call for reinforcements? No! She yelled. She announced her arrival over the phone. What action was expected of me? Say not to her, and that her brother is... He snarled. That her brother what? She looked away. I left all your messages on the desk, she said quietly. A protracted silence ensued. I purchased some replacement heifers, he eventually uttered, his deep voice once again bearing iron control. And a few bulls to increase my herd size. We are going to clear those records tomorrow. Yes, she muttered in response. Maggie. Her hand was on the doorknob as she hesitated, not looking back at him. What? Don't wear that dress again. She dared not ask why he did this. His voice had a husky note that was almost sufficient to answer. She went upstairs to her private room, sat in a chair by the closed window, and used the little lamplight to read her letter. Margaretta Donahue, if I had had more time to plan it, I would have sent you a ticket to Stonehenge. It started with a thick, heavy, masculine hand. As it is, I was holding out for a free week, which, to be completely honest, I don't think I'll get. You'll discover that everything is paid for, including the cruise, meals, and hotel. I would have forced you to accept this ticket if I hadn't had to rush home. Maggie, please accept it. Make fun of an elderly man who spent some of the happiest moments of his life with you. It resembled a return to home. I'm not sure if you believe in déjà vu, the letter went on, causing her to shiver uncontrollably. However, if incidents like this occur, it's possible that we had a deeper connection than just coffee and conversation. This life was not meant for us. Perhaps the next time. With sincere fondness. Johnson, Duke. Perhaps the next time. She folded the letter back around the ticket and closed her eyes. She stared at the ticket and read the letter again after the tears subsided. It was for a fully paid round-trip cruise that was scheduled to start the following Monday, with stops at archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean. She gazed at it indifferently. At a time when she ought to be looking for work, could she really afford to go now? The disorienting thoughts were momentarily stopped by Emma's voice inviting her to dinner. She struggled with deciding whether or not to take the cruise. She was desperate to do so. However, she struggled to balance her enjoyment with the pressing issue of finding employment after leaving the ranch. She hadn't disclosed the ticket to anyone. It was tucked into Duke's letter and kept safely in her purse, kept out of sight like a prayer too valuable to share with anyone. But it was evident that she was troubled. The day before Jana was supposed to return home, she felt Clint's sultry gaze on her during breakfast. She thought bitterly that despite his efforts to avoid her company since returning from his trip, he was watching her like a hawk these days. It was no small accomplishment that he'd avoided her. Emma's eyebrows were raised. It simultaneously hurt and relieved Maggie. Thankfully, there were no terrifying temptations for her to resist. None existed. When she had finally finished picking at the eggs and bacon on her plate, Clint growled, Why don't you talk about it instead of sitting there with that damned crucified look on your face? Her face twitched up, and her eyes burned. Why don't you mind your own business? You are my business, he said very briefly, not for much longer. Praise God. Emma, who had just entered with a plateful of ham, was shoved aside as she hurried out. Maggie? She questioned. Clint followed her out the door with his eyes blazing and his jaw clenched. Clint, what? Emma muttered. It appeared like they were not even listening to her. She shrugged and sighed and returned the ham to the kitchen. Maggie was thrown around by Clint when he caught up to her on the front porch, using a harsh and cruel hand. He growled, Stop having tantrums, or I'll give you my remedy for them. Her hair was tossed around impatiently. Please let go of my arm. Where are you going? To get a ride. Is that okay? Or do I need to do something else? He met her eyes and gently pressed a long finger to her lips, reading the storm of emotions that was tearing at her. No more, he murmured. Join me on this ride. It will be beneficial. Hating that yielding start, she looked up at him helplessly. Aren't you busy? Always, honey, he smiled amicably. I can go alone, she muttered. He said, I want to be with you. A few stray hairs brushed away from her lips by his slender hand. We haven't had much time together since I've been home. You preferred it that way, she shot back, turning her face away from him. I am aware. Clint. Her gaze raised to his, holding a question in it. He gave a headshake. Not right now, not just yet. His dark brows furrowed as he peered down at her, as though she made up some kind of puzzle that he was unable to solve. Damn it, woman. Her bottom lip quivered with the unexpected rage. She moaned, What have I done now? With a sharp inhale, he turned away. Don't worry, come on, please. For several minutes, they rode in companionable silence, and Maggie knew that when she left the ranch, she would treasure this time with him like a gold mine. When he wasn't staring at her, her gaze darted to him, tracking his strong shoulders, straight back, and sharp profile. It felt refreshing to see him in the desert. She wished that she had remembered to pack her camera so she could have a photo of him to bring home, and she let out a sigh. He would always be in her heart, and she would always have a picture of him. That, in itself, would be eerie. He questioned her, What are you thinking about after some time? As they reined in and settled down side by side to sit quietly on their horses, she sighed and grinned at the expanse of open country. The memories, she said. There are so many of them. The meadow where I used to pick wildflowers with Jana, the pecan trees with their deliciously fat fall pecans, the stream where I made love to you. With her eyes on the brim of his hat, pulled low to shade his glittering eyes, she glared at him, flushed. Were you always that conceited, or did you have to work at it? She replied. You make me conceited, little girl, he shot back. My God, you would still be engaged if you had responded to your dumb fiancé the same way you do to me physically. She ignored him, her teeth clenched together. He lit a cigarette and threw his leg over the pommel of his saddle. He pushed the brim back over his eyes, and even from that distance, the green, fiery, and strange flames burned into her face. He asked, his voice low and deep like a whip. How was it, Maggie? How did kissing me feel? Ever since you were 16, you had desired it. Was daydreaming worthwhile? She examined her quivering hands gripping the reins, scarcely realizing what a nightmare the ride had become. He drew the cigarette slowly for a long time. No return? Perhaps I let you down, he said ruthlessly as his eyes narrowed. Little one, infatuation can't withstand the demands a man can make on a woman, can it? In the same way that dreams resist reality. It's so unfortunate that you were unaware of that 4 summers ago." "Amen," she uttered with her teeth chattering. Was that what? The sound of his laughter hurt more than the words that had been spoken. "Honey, I don't know of a better way to heal you. I'd had just about enough hero worship for one lifetime. I was kind to both of us." She said, "Thanks," in a faint whisper. "Coming on the heels of my broken engagement, it was just what I needed." "You're breaking my heart." She glared at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears as she shot back. "You don't have one. You wouldn't know what to do with it if you had one." With a shrug, he returned the cigarette to his well-defined lips. "Maybe," he mutely answered. "But you'd better thank your lucky stars that I have a conscience, young lady," he said with a smile. "I could have had you." She closed her eyes to the anguish and shame because it was the truth, and it hurt like crazy. With a fierce expression on his face, he roared, "Infatuation or not, you wanted me!" With a broken whisper, "To my everlasting shame," she said. When her eyes met his, they were filled with hurt and tears. He felt as though she had given him a slap on his face. She muttered, "Jana or no Jana, I'm leaving in the morning. I've been tortured by you enough for one lifetime." Leaning forward in the saddle like devils on the chase, she whirled the mare and urged her into a gallop as she made her way back to the house without looking. Clint, though, was not trailing her. Smoke wafted from the forgotten cigarette in his hand, and he sat motionless in his saddle, eyes vacant and blind. If it weren't for Emma, supper was a hassle, and Maggie wouldn't have felt the slightest guilt about skipping it. Throughout the meal, she spoke to Clint without a word and avoided looking his way. Emma, positioned in the center, attempted to maintain the conversation by launching into a monologue about the government, the weather, and the Napoleonic Wars. However, it was hopeless. They did not even raise their eyes. While Clint stormed off into his den and shut the door behind him with such force that it rattled windows, Maggie assisted in clearing the table. "Is it because you're leaving tomorrow?" Emma inquired as they dried off. "I'm not sure." She put a plate aside to dry. "We had an argument while we were out riding." "You've had arguments since you were 8 years old, Missy, but he didn't ever slam doors before or leave good coffee sitting in his cup without even tasting it." Emma gave her a beseeching look. "Maggie, please stay put." "Not in this manner." Tragically, "You don't understand, Emma. I have to," she uttered. "Why? Because you fear that he will force you to give in?" Her pale eyes flashed with surprise as her face jerked upward. "Oh, yes, I know," Emma remarked kindly. "You two have it written all over you. You know why he got Brent out of here, don't you? Why has he been staring at you nonstop lately?" She lowered her gaze to the sink's soapy water. "I can't give him what he wants." "Maggie, do you know what he wants?" "Does he?" "Oh, yes," was her sour response. "He wants me to find someone else to hero worship," Emma said. "Isn't that strange that he didn't seem to mind it before?" Maggie took the drying cloth to yet another plate. Emma urged, "Remain a day longer. Everything will be better when Jana arrives in the morning. You'll discover. Emma, take him his coffee and get my head snapped off?" The older woman lightly touched her hand. "Maggie, this cannot go on much longer. It's tearing the two of you apart. Talk to him and give him his coffee. Maggie, I believe that he is more hurt than angry. A bomb could not injure him." "He is untouchable," she snarled. "Go on." With a final bitter look at Emma, she reluctantly sighed and picked up the mug of hot coffee, carrying it into the study. As she entered after his stern, "Come in!" she thought it was like confronting a lion on his home turf. After closing the door, she moved the coffee to his large oak desk. With a cigarette in his hand, he stood smoking outside on the patio, his shoulder pressed against the door jamb. He turned to watch her put down the cup and she gasped at the sheer manliness that gushed from his towering, strong frame. A thick mat of curly dark hair protruded from his shirt, unbuttoned against the heat and hanging loosely from his broad shoulders, creating a wedge against the smooth bronze muscles of his stomach and chest. His thick hair appeared disheveled, as though he had worked it restlessly with his fingers. She had never seen his eyes so dark, so solemn and narrow. She stammered. Emma said to bring your coffee to you," her words coming shakily as he turned from the door and headed in her direction. Silently, "Where's yours?" he inquired. "Mine. You could have had it with me." "Oh." She looked at the rug. "I had mine in the kitchen." He sat on the desk's edge and squeezed out the last of the cigarette. "I wish it weren't like this," she sadly muttered. "I don't want to leave here with you hating me." "I don't hate you," he said in a serious tone. "No," she reasoned, because that needed feeling, and he had none. He was merely uninterested. She looked at her footwear. "Anyway, I appreciate you letting me come," she uttered softly. "I apologize for leaving you without a secretary." "You aren't," he stated icily. "Lita and I crossed paths while I was away. Overnight, the marriage fell apart. She will arrive on Monday." He gave a thoughtless smile. "You see, little girl, you made a wise decision in leaving." Nothing negative occurred. She had a throbbing pain in her heart, but she smiled brightly. "No harm was done," she repeated. "Well, I'll say goodnight. Take this back with you." After emptying the mug, he gave it to her. However, he sensed her icy trembling as their fingers made contact, and something appeared to burst in his eyes. He whispered, cool as ice, through pursed lips. But only on the outside. He swiftly extended his hand, grasping her shoulder and pulling her towards him. His jade eyes were on an unnerving level with her in this half-sitting position. He scowled angrily. "You don't like me to know just how much I affect you, Irish?" she begged, losing all willpower at the ruthless rage she saw in his eyes. "Don't! Clint, please, let me go! Don't!" "What don't you do? Embarrass you?" he asked. With a swift motion, he grabbed the cup from her and threw it onto the desk. He slammed her against him with his thin hands tightly gripping her shoulders. "Clint, I'm sorry," she uttered, finally understanding what was off. After she had wounded his pride, he was seeking retribution. He bowed his head and snarled, "I'm going to teach you what shame is because you don't know what it is." "Clint!" As his firm lips pressed against hers, teaching her the painful power of a kiss, her voice broke on the plea. She made an effort to resist the cruel, hard arms holding her, but she was unable to break free or breathe, giving in to a strength that was far stronger than her own. Subsequently, as if by magic, the force of his powerful arms subsided, cradling her as tenderly as he had previously injured her. His lips relaxed, softening and luring in a gentle manner. "Maggie," he murmured against her broken lips as he ran his hands under her blouse's hem and burned against her exposed back. "Maggie, you feel like silk." She hung there, panting, her fingers curling into the cotton of his shirt as he played with her mouth, short, sharp kisses that ignited flames in her brain. His hands were warm and slender, gently caressing her smooth skin with a faint, rasping sound. "Touch me," he huskily whispered. "Touch me, honey." As she caressed him blindly, sensually feeling his sensual masculinity and drowning in the tangy scent of his cologne, her slender hands involuntarily moved from the cotton shirt onto the warm, bronzed muscles of his broad chest, tangling in the thick cushion of curling black hair. Sensation after sensation washed over her. "Like that, hellcat," he muttered. "Maggie, just slightly open your mouth. I'd like to give it a taste." He opened her soft lips, drawing her completely against the long, warm body, building the pressure until he heard the moan smothered under his mouth. Burning with the hunger he created in her, she surrendered mindlessly. He growled huskily. "Did that milksop fiancé of yours ever kiss you like this, Maggie? Did he stir you until you moaned against his mouth?" With fainting, she begged, "Oh, don't," her thin hands offering a feeble protest against the pleasure his were giving her. "Not at all?" "You desire it," he muttered. His mouth, open and moist and purposefully sensual, brushed idly over hers. "Maggie, don't you want my hands and eyes to be on every inch of this adorable young body? Respond to me, do you not?" She started to cry out loud. "Yes," she sobbed. "Damn you, yes." "Ask me nice and sweet, Maggie." He made fun of Maggie. "Say it, Irish. Please, Clint. Whisper it." Slowly, her eyes opened, shining with love and longing. She whispered, "Please," into his harsh, tormenting mouth. "Please, Clint." Abruptly, he thrust her roughly away, his hands contracting around her waist. A ruthless, icy smile pulled at his lips. "And that settles the score, Miss O'Neill. You desired an object of shame. You're capable." It took her a few moments to comprehend what he had said and done. Red, then white, was her face. Incredibly white. Embarrassed by the score, even. Feeling as though she had been slammed with all the strength in that tanned, lean hand, she gaped at him numbly. Calmly, he snapped the lighter shut and pocketed it, while flicking her stunned expression with his narrowed eyes. "You've been following me around like a damned pet dog since you were about 8 years old," he said. "In case it matters later, I'm sick of it. I refuse to act as a replacement for a cheating partner or as a comfort to a wounded heart. Look away from this point on if you want to be made love to. I'm over teaching you things." If possible, her face turned even whiter. The words to express to him how hateful she found him to be were stuck in her mouth. She felt bruised and beaten inside. Tears trickled down her long lashes, tears she averted from his sight. She approached the door without thinking. He chastised, "No comeback, Maggie." She reached for the doorknob. He insisted, "Would you like me to kiss you goodbye?" She pulled open the door and left. "Irish!" She shut the door behind her and hurried up the stairs, heedlessly. She had a hazy memory of the door opening behind her and seeing eyes pursuing her. She didn't slow down, though, or turn around. Not even once. For hours, Maggie sat in the dark in the chair by her bed, hurting more than anything else could possibly explain. The willful brutality was nearly intolerable. He anticipated hurting her. She had observed the contentment in his emerald eyes, and all because she had wounded her pride, just for that reason alone. Ever since she had closed the door behind her and entered this dark, secure womb, the tears had not stopped, had not abated, had not relaxed. Not when Emma's voice softly called her name and the knock on the door came hesitantly. Not when she heard two voices, one soft and pleading, the other deep and slow and angry, coming from outside the locked room. She hadn't got out of the chair or gone to sleep when the first rays of dawn broke through the fluffy white curtains. Her face was still as white as it had been the night before, with crimson rims around her dark, shadowed eyes. She packed silently and effectively, taking her toiletries from the bathroom and cosmetics from the chest of drawers, packing both clean and dirty clothes into the one suitcase. She denied herself the right to reflect. Not about the feelings she'd had for Clint, not about what he'd done to her, not about the pain of spending the rest of her life apart from him. All she could think about was getting away. Right now, all that remained important in her life was escape. She desired to sprint. She didn't stop to run a brush through her hair before picking up the case and shutting the door without turning around. Maggie said in a strange, hesitant tone, "Oh, there you are," as Emma arrived at the foot of the staircase. Missy, are you set for breakfast? You can't possibly be leaving without eating breakfast, can you? Maggie just gave a brief, silent shake of her head in lieu of a response. With composure, she picked up the phone and requested a cab, knowing as she put it down that Clint had entered the hallway. Emma shot him a quick glance before walking out of the hallway and softly clicking the kitchen door shut. Just as Maggie picked up her case and headed for the front porch, Clint moved to stand silently in front of her, his hands firmly tucked into his jeans pockets. His own face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. She gave him just a chilly, fleeting glance before turning away. Her voice was unusually quiet as she said, "Please move out of my way. I want to talk to you, Maggie." She said, "Write me a letter," addressing her shoes. "If you try, you can probably come up with a few more insults by the time you mail it," he moaned. "Maggie!" and reached out to touch her shoulder. She recoiled from him, her eyes burning and wide, as though he had sliced her to the bone. "Never do that again," she trembledly whispered. "Never touch me again. I'm leaving your life as soon as possible, Clint. Isn't that sufficient?" Her eyes were filled with mist. She cried, "What more do you want from me? Blood?" He took a slow, deep breath. His eyes searched her face, something dark and serious in them as he whispered, "My God, I never meant to hurt you." "You didn't, did you?" she questioned angrily. "You wanted to take Lita's hide, but I was here and she wasn't. Now that she's returning, perhaps things will start to improve." He growled as Maggie headed for the door, saying, "Maggie, not like this, for God's sake. I want to tell you." With accusing eyes, she told Clint, "The score's even, you said so," as she stood on the porch. "I want to hear nothing more that you have to say. You covered everything last night." His gaze narrowed, as though he was in pain, and he looked at her with a quiet, inquiring look, as though he had never seen her before, and was drawn to her face. "No, my dear," he uttered softly. "I should have said more. Maggie." With a sigh of relief that caused her slender shoulders to slump, she turned and started down the steps as a loud car horn from up the driveway interrupted him. "Tell Emma I'll write to Jana and say goodbye," she called over her shoulder. His face was expressionless, and he stared at the thin figure intently as it crept into the taxi and the door shut. With haunted and tortured eyes, he watched her go, the cab slowly turning into a yellow dot in the distance. After him, Emma emerged onto the porch and used the white apron to pat dry her hands. "I've got breakfast," she uttered quietly. He remained silent, his expression expressionless. Emma reminded him that you wanted her to go. "That's what you told me last night." He turned and entered his den in the house, firmly shutting the door behind him. Emma sighed and turned to return to the kitchen, wondering absent-mindedly how she would ever explain all of this to Jana. Later, Maggie read Duke Johnson's letter a third time while drowsily sitting on the bus to Miami. She silently thanked the big, dark man for providing this escape route. Going back to the apartment just yet, facing Jana and the questions that would inevitably come up, was more than she could bear. The wound was too fresh and too raw to be examined at this time. She looked lovingly at the ticket that promised escape in a few days, a few weeks. It served as a relief from the excessive suffering. Philip first, and then Clint in particular. She shut her eyes to block out the sour recollection. Would she ever get over the way he had made her feel small? And would she ever recover from the crushing blow to her pride? Her gaze shifted towards the window, the horizon filled with pines and palmettos, and the sporadic house hidden among the trees. From now on, things were going to be awkward. If they meant the ranch and Clint, she would never be able to celebrate holidays with Jana again. When he visited his sister while on a business trip, it would get worse. She let out a tired sigh. Maybe she should move away from her childhood friend and look for work in Atlanta. That would also hurt a lot. Perhaps, though, it would be best in the long run. She closed her weary eyes and leaned her head back against the seat. It felt like a very long time since she had slept or experienced any kind of peace. She was thinking only of Clint and the past. She and Clint had chatted about horses while sitting on the porch swing together what seemed like ages ago, or took long rides through the forest while listening to his stories about the earliest days of Florida's exploration, when canoeists traveled on scouting expeditions down the Suwannee River. For her, he brought the Sunshine State to life. She was able to witness the arrogant Spanish conquerors trudging through the dense undergrowth near the river. She could envision the lofty sailing vessels that sailed from Florida's sandy shoreline, headed either to the Indies or South America. She let out a sigh. As a child, Clint had liked her. They had a friendship. She could hear the drums of the proud and fierce Seminoles who fought 3 wars between 1817 and 1858, but were never subjugated by the U.S. government. But no amount of tears could make him anything other than an enemy now, not after his treatment of her. She closed her eyes, the memory hurting her. Had the embarrassment he'd caused really been necessary? She wondered. What she said about being ashamed of how he could make her feel while they were riding. Why should it have upset him so much? She absently shook her head. Had he intended to embarrass her, he had succeeded in doing so. She was perplexed, though, by the expression on his face the following morning, the dark, hungry look in his green eyes as he watched her drive away from the ranch. Did he see pain or guilt in his eyes? Her eyebrows furrowed. She pondered Jana's reaction upon her arrival and if Clint would disclose the entire tale to his sister. She had not disclosed that she would be visiting Miami. She had the cruise ticket, but no one knew it. Emma and Clint had just assumed she was returning to Columbus. Looking out the tinted bus window at the cloudy landscape with the setting sun creating beautiful flames in the sky, she wondered, well, what difference did it make? How quickly the day had gone by, and before long the Miami skyline would be visible in the distance. She shifted on the cozy chair restlessly. Miami. Other than Emma and Jana, would any of them be concerned? She would send Jana a postcard from her travels to Greece, Crete, or any other destination. It was Jana and Emma, she corrected.